everyone, and welcome to Depth Insights, where we take a depth psychological look at news and events that are going on in your world. My name is BonnieBright, and I'm your host, and I'm also the founder of Depth Psychology Alliance, which is an online community for everyone who's interested in Jungian and depth psychology. And you can see or hear, perhaps if you're just listening to this by audio, that I'm here today with my guest, Gary Bobroff. Hi, Gary. Welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Glad to have you with me. Thanks for being here. I'm really excited to talk about Gary's work today because he has some exciting events coming up that are based on a lot of his work in the past and just seems to be growing richer and richer over time. And it's been really such a pleasure and so interesting to watch the process, Gary, by which you've built one upon another. So I'm going to go ahead and share with everybody a little bit about Gary's bio in case you don't know who Gary is. Gary Bobroff was the producer of the Synchronicity Matter and Psyche Symposium in 2014. And I had the pleasure of being there at that event. It was pretty remarkable, I have to say, and we'll talk a little bit more about that for obvious reasons, I guess, once we get into this. But did an amazing job putting that together. And Gary is an international speaker, author, and workshop leader, and his work brings insights from Jungian psychology to our pursuit of modern questions. I love that, Gary. That's definitely something that's interesting to me as well, and I think it's probably why we're both here today together. So we're going to dig into that. Gary is also the primary developer and facilitator of archetypal nature, which is something that he will talk about more, and I know is truly a love of yours, Gary. It's a topic that you are passionate about. And Gary has an MA in Counseling Psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute, and his first book, Crop Circles, Jung and the Reemergence of the Archetypal Feminine, was published in August of 2014 by North Atlantic Books. And Gary has been prominently featured in the upcoming film, Time is Art, Synchronicity and the Collective Dream, which I saw was just released actually on DVD or download, I guess.
You can pre-order it now.
Yeah, awesome. Very good. I'm looking forward to seeing that whole thing. I've seen little clips of it. You can find clips of it on Facebook here and there, but I'm looking forward to seeing the whole thing. And there you have it. Yeah, very nice. Okay, well, so now that you know a little bit about Gary, let's just jump in. Gary, I had mentioned that you hosted the Synchronicity Symposium in Joshua Tree last year. And of course, you had an amazing lineup of guests there and a really remarkable turnout. It was just so well put together, and I was so thrilled to be able to be there personally as well. I wondered if you would talk to us a little bit about primarily Rupert Sheldrake, who was one of your main keynote speakers and who many of our audience will be familiar with his work, and just how his work ties into that. But before we do that, I wanted to just touch basically on this, on the title of the upcoming webinar series that you're doing. Now, this 5-session webinar series starts on September 13th, so that's coming right up. And you're going to be hosting that with Cynthia Cavalli, and together you will be exploring, this will be a grounded exploration into the heart of the mystery of the extension of consciousness. So that's a mouthful. That's the title of the webinar series. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that entails?
Yeah, what I like about Sheldrake, and what I like about everyone that joined us at the Synchronicity Symposium, which if your listeners and viewers don't know, guys, Bonnie was the co-MC with me and did a really tremendous job of introducing the speakers and creating a container that really resonated with everyone that attended. And I think that's the biggest thing that people report, is that it was a really grounded, safe space to grow beyond themselves and to stretch out with material that challenged their worldview and took them to a deeper place. So even Sheldrake talks about that at the start of one of his talks, that this was a really lovely weekend, and I think I want to thank you for helping me to create that energy with those folks.
Thank you. It was really amazing. It was a great experience for me too, and I can't imagine that anybody walked away from that weekend not changed in some way. So fantastic job. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Rupert really was the key for me with the whole thing. And, it's amazing to me that people haven't really tried to connect Sheldrake and Synchronicity yet. And I think it's partly because, Rupert's really a scientist and Jung's really a psychologist, and they're kind of, to some degree, coming at the world from two different points of view. But the great thing about, Jung, when he's observing synchronicity, is he's talking about empirical things that actually happened. It's not, a theory in the sense of there's actual events that he has to explain. it's grounded in the reality of the experience. And Rupert Sheldrake's work on the extension of consciousness, observing the fields that join, a person and someone who's watching them, for example, or a group of animals. We'll talk more about it. That field sensibility, I think, has a lot of resonance with the question of synchronicity. So, we'll talk more about it, but I like that both these folks are grounded and objective. And that's what you can do is when you're dealing with cutting edge people that are grounded and objective, okay, now you can start, taking the steps forward. And I really think Rupert's a visionary and someone that the history books are going to be talking about because he challenged the dogma, of the time, Galileo or Copernicus or someone. I feel like Sheldrake and Rick Tarnas too, who was at the symposium, I would consider really true visionary pioneers who are really challenging the assumptions of our day. So it's a great honor to have him there. And so he looks at the extension of consciousness, but he does it through biology. So he actually does scientific experiments to test if what he believes is true. So for example, with dogs that know when their owners are coming home, one of his books, they actually would set up video cameras in people's homes who had pets that would do this. And what they found out is that the animal is not responding to when they hear a car or some sort of sensory information. The animal goes to the door when the owner sets the intention to return home.
Yeah.
So, connections of feeling there. The same way we see it with synchronicity, where it's you break up with someone and you run into them all over town. That kind of synchronistic stuff very often has to do with heart. And if people are, are academic types, his other two books will be great. Science Delusion, he looks at these dogma of materialism that we have today and challenges all of them. And then The Sense of Being Stared At is just a tremendous work where he looked at all of the evidence, all the studies that have been done on telepathy and card guessing, as well as many, many, many different, studies and ways of looking at these questions. And so if you want to really know what the evidence is today for the extension of consciousness beyond the brain in a single book, read The Sense of Being Stared At, and you will no longer believe that this is where consciousness lives. I mean, this is a TV receiver. It's not the TV station.
Right. Yeah, it's really exciting to hear you talk about this because obviously in the study of depth psychology, a lot of us are familiar with these kinds of ideas, things like interspecies communication and this whole idea of field theory and the fact that we are connected, even if it's invisible. And even a lot of indigenous cultures we are aware of are adhere to the idea that consciousness or intelligence is not actually located in the brain. The brain is for where the spirits live or other things, but it's located in the gut or in other parts of the body. And so all of these ideas, for me, are so fascinating. They're not necessarily new, but of course, in the world that we live in, where science and particularly STEM, the whole idea about science, technology, and mathematics being taught in schools to such a degree that even the arts and philosophy are being are falling away. It's really disturbing on some level. And so I'm excited to see somebody like Sheldrake who is able to have sort of a foot in both worlds. And I'm excited to see you working with him because you are very much that way as well in what I understand from your work. Gary, I just wanted to mention in the webinar series that you are doing, you are going to be featuring an exclusive, never before aired interview with Rupert Sheldrake in one of the weeks. And so I'm excited to tune in for that. And I think that people will be fascinated to hear in his own words, if they haven't had a chance to do that yet. Yeah,
that's right. And I think, Rupert's, a genius and a really smart guy, but I also think that I don't know how much time he's spent with Jung. I think that there's a potential dialogue there. So I'm going to do the best I can do to try and facilitate that dialogue. And I've talked to him a little bit personally about, the role of feeling, especially. That's the biggest thing about synchronicity for me that people miss. They always go on the head trip and the meaning trip, and there's all these feeling parts that are tossed away too quickly with synchronicity. And I think that's how you connect to all the research he's done with fields and animals and people. So to me, that's a big question just to see what he has to say about that. And I think there's other parts of synchronicity, and it'd be great if Cynthia, we're hoping she's going to be able to join me as well for that dialogue, and Jill Peirce may participate as well. So, what could come out of that dialogue, I don't know, but I'm going to try and and throw some Jungian questions toward him that maybe are stuff that might be fresh to him, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, Sheldrake, and I don't know him at all, so I'm not speaking for him, of course, but he must be familiar to some extent with Jung, and even just being exposed to so much of the depth psychological topics and approaches that we experienced at the Synchronicity conference in 2014. I'm sure that he has some exposure, but I would be absolutely fascinated to have myself to see that happen more directly, as you're kind of talking about, to really engage in that kind of dialogue and conversation. So I hope that's a really fruitful line of questioning for you.
I'll have to do some homework.
Yeah, you will. I'm looking forward to that. Do you want to talk a little bit about Jung's concept of synchronicity? Again, most people listening to this probably are familiar with it, but can you just say a little bit more about how you connect Jung's idea of synchronicity with Sheldrake's work?
Sure. Well, to really, start to explain Sheldrake's work and Jung's work on synchronicity, I'd probably need to tell you a little bit more about Sheldrake too. And so, I think a lot of our listeners are going to know that C.G. Jung coined the term synchronicity to relate to meaningful but acausally related events, and that he developed that dialogue with Einstein and Pauli, the great physicist of the 20th century. And that they posited acausality as a kind of synchronicity, or acausality as a kind of principle that stands in distinction to causality, that both can exist in this world, and that somehow in this world it seems to want these acausal, meaningful things to go on. To me, you get to some heavy questions here, because it presupposes either that from the very beginning the world has wanted to create consciousness, which is very interesting, or there's something pulling us towards that. I mean, Jung talked about the future as pulling events into accord in a way that we could never see before, and that's a tremendously heavy idea. But I think there's a couple things to understand about Sheldrake's work to help answer that question. So, card guessing, for example. So, a very common telepathy test, and he's been doing recently the sense of being stared at tests as well, where someone will be looking at someone else and they're blindfolded and the other person's behind them, and they'll do a test and say, am I looking at you? Am I not looking at you at a certain moment? And they'll say yes, no, whatever. And he gets a consistent about 55% correct, which statistically is humongous, 1,000 to 1 odds that there's not something going on there. And so we know that people can be connected. And this card guessing stuff, what they found was that who's best at the card guessing tests? Family members. Who's the most best? Twins. Exactly what we would intuitively expect.
Right.
What about critics? People that don't believe in the possibility of telepathy score negatively below chance average on tests of telepathy.
Based on their connection with the subject, yes. I guess. Yeah.
Yes. You get what I'm saying? That their belief, their disbelief shows up in the results. So they're proving their disbelief. Yeah. You understand what I mean? They if it's it's 25% chance, they're scoring at 20. And it's why is that? Well, they know the right answer sometimes, or that they're putting it up. They actually have to be pushing psychically against the whole thing quite a bit. So,
right. Well, it's like what we know now in quantum physics. If you stare at a thing, it changes, right? The second that you look at something, it's no longer what it was before.
Absolutely. And, Rupert's looked at the past century of books and writings about that. And there's tremendous amount of writing about this, including a book by a guy named Long in 1919, where he looked at this in wolves and how they're connected by fields over great distances. And, for example, one of the ways this is still going on is I have a cousin who's in the Canadian Military Reserve, and he went through training in the last couple of years, and they still train people the way they taught them in World War II, which is if you're sneaking up on someone, don't look right at them. So this is, this is the military. This is not.
So suddenly you have an actual biological and I guess psychological reason for not doing that. I wouldn't have realized that before.
That's right. It's out there in the culture and it's real. Yeah. And another thing with this kind of card guessing stuff is that novelty shows up in the results. Beginner's luck. Rupert finds that to be true in his work, and Jung wrote about that a lot. And the power of novelty, again, it's about emotion and the newness, and also coming to something as kind of naive, that energy, that purity. And for me, where we end up with a lot of these things is the idea of the Tao and the ancient Chinese views of the world thousands of years ago, where people were writing whole tombs on this idea that there's an ebb and flow of feeling between the world. What they talked about as being key with it was sincerity, authenticity, things like that the universe responds to our inner state, our inner right state. And of course, one of the conditions of doing good work in therapy is you have to be honest. You have to, so it's these things put together,
They do, and it also brings to mind the image of child mind, right? To approach something with that kind of beginner's mind, which is talked about in Zen circles a lot. And you of course, refer to that too. And it brings up so much potentiality. It's really an exciting topic. I wish we could talk more about it. And I guess it's one reason to attend the webinars, because I know that you'll be sharing a lot of these kinds of stories and ideas.
I can give you one more bit of Sheldrake if you want.
Please.
Okay. So I'll let this play. So in the field effect that we see in birds and fish and other animals, if you look at film studies of these, there's no way that the bodies of these animals can coordinate these movements biologically. The adjustments are happening too quick for the brain to process them. There has to be a field going on there. And think about that with synchronicity, right? Where we maybe, get a phone, we have a feeling, think of someone when the phone rings. That's a classic one. Well, again, it's about field. It's about connection over distance. And I think, that again is where Sheldrake and Jung come together with those kind of ideas.
Yeah. It's just fascinating. We understand these patterns, these fields are going on right under our noses all the time, right? It's just because they're invisible to us does not mean they're not there. But of course, I think it's really important. That's the thing about consciousness. You have to be open and aware and present to the moment to begin to be able to then start tapping in and seeing some of these patterns as they emerge. Sometimes they just happen to us and you can't deny it, because it's almost like the universe or psyche has put something so directly in our path that it's to wake us up and bring our attention to it. But,
Cynthia has a great story from that, from her husband Tom Cavalli's practice work, and he was talking about to a client one time who had his relationship was really bad, and right in the middle of the session, Tom just really had been trying not to say it, and he just said, "Your relationship's a car wreck," and at that moment, bam! Outside the office, there was a car crash.
Wow.
So that's one of those.
Yeah. And then that word acausal comes back up again. And speaking of that, maybe we can just touch on this, because I think it's really important, and we've alluded to it a little bit, but I'm sure that there are a lot of cultural sort of obstacles that get in the way of this work. I wondered if you could just say something more about that.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, and Rupert talks about this, is that the people that are skeptical tend to not bother to do the work of actually looking at the evidence. And Rupert admits to, as a very young man, doing the same thing himself, to just say, I don't need to look at the evidence because it can't possibly be true. And that's when you're dealing with the taboo. It's like, it's religion, at that point. And our society unconsciously makes us poo-poo this stuff and say, oh, that can't be real, that can't be real. And it's a bias, and it comes out of the inflation of our age that Jung wrote about and talked about. We suffer from a cultural grandiosity where we're high on ourselves, and all that energy that we used to put out into the world in terms of awe and like the indigenous or earliest cultures, the folks would walk around and just see wonder everywhere and just, send that Newman out into the world. Well, we've just jammed all that Newman into ourselves, and now we look for God in the iPhone. That's where God is, right? So we're high on ourselves, and you look at little fantasies we have, like oh, we accidentally radiate a spider, and then that spider bites us, and now we have superpowers.
Right.
High on your own technology. What is radiation? It's something people make. And what does it do? It kills us. And we're so high on ourselves that we imagine that it gives you godlike powers. So little things like that, little subtle clues that show that we're higher on ourselves. So I think you have to let go of that cultural grandiosity that says, I need to know, I need to be certain all the time, and just say, hey, let's look at some evidence here and let's be open-minded and proceed.
Right. Yeah. Being open to the possibilities and therefore to the field. And I suspect the more that we're open, and at least I found this in my life, the more I open myself to it, the more these things can happen. And it's kind of self-perpetuating, right? It creates an autonomous kind of pattern that then allows me to open my mind even further.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. Well, Gary, before we go, I just, I read your bio at the beginning, and I kind of assume, I guess, because I know so well a lot of your work, and I think it should be known. It's just very profound. But can you just share a little bit about your work? I know we mentioned the book, but maybe the book and crop circles, because they're just such an absolute fascination for me. If you could just say something briefly.
Yeah, thank you. So there's the book there, and in the book, I really look at the basic symbols of crop circles. So grain is related to the archetypal feminine, to the miracle of life that our culture puts away. And instead of connecting to the grain goddess or the miracle of life, or that force in us that feels and knows the miraculous and the connection to the archetypal feminine inside us, we have materialism, right? We have the dark side of mater, materialism, mother. So this compulsive desire for things. And so, the dark side is materialism, but the bright side is mysteries, like all the mysteries of the feminine, which I consider synchronicity to be one. Quantum physics and the connection of psyche and matter, all this kind of stuff that's opening up. It's the light side of the possibility of our relationship to the feminine. The dark side of our possibility of relationship to the feminine is the destruction of the planet. Without relating to it, we just take it for granted and destroy it. And you have to have that inflated state in order to really, truly take it. It's an ego masculine inflation that we suffer from. So we have to correct for that and keep our objectivity, but bring it around, bring the masculine around to the mysterious of the feminine, to the dark of the feminine, what we've done to the earth, all those things. And that's what I do in the book, and really look at the psychology of how we deal with the unknown. And I also was really fortunate to find some really unique documents that connect Jung and crop circles via Tony Wolff. And one of the paintings that I found that connects them and the commentary on them from Tony Wolff, Jung actually chose for the cover of his book on UFOs. And I get to go through these series of images and see where this UFO swirls down and turns into a plant and does some very crop circle-like things. So I felt lucky.
Absolutely fascinating. I mean, the book is really for everybody. The book is really a must read. And I did just want to, just to close, because I feel like I want to say that, it's not very long ago that we've had this massive spill from into the Animas River in Colorado. And I think most people who are listening to this, even a while after it's recorded, probably will be familiar with those images of that just gold, yellow color in the rivers just flowing down. And of course, this river feeds other sources for people's drinking water, and it's headed to Lake Powell, and, nobody can go in the river and all of that. And I've been so struck by a number of things that are rather synchronistic, good or bad, about this whole thing. And the fact that it's coming from mines where people were, you talk about the dark side of nature and matter and consumerism, people were mining for all these materials. Not that I haven't benefited from it. My iPhone is made out of the same kind of materials that everybody else's are made out of. But I just think there's something about paying attention to what's happening here and the messages that are coming through from, as you say, we have to have some capacity for holding the mystery of what's happening here, and for paying attention and being conscious of what's going on, and just looking at how our greed or our way of life, if you want to look at it that way, because maybe it's more relatable, is just, transitioning into something like the Animas River, speaking of Anima Mundi, or the soul of the world, right, is being completely destroyed. And at what point will we be beyond the point of no return, where sure, the earth will go on, but life as we know it can't go on. And so I think that your work is really critical to this.
Thank you. And it's really about choosing different values.
Yeah.
Rather than putting mindlessly putting, words like economic necessity, that's we're using these rational words to do the greatest possible damage.
Yeah. And I think it's what you mentioned earlier. It's about the feeling. It's about feeling into that interconnectedness, knowing that we are, that river, that we are part of the earth, that we are those animals that are being displaced, the fish that are being just killed, across the board. And just beginning to attempt to understand what our place is in that greater web of life. So anyway, I managed to, I tend to direct all conversations toward these kinds of things because there's so much on my mind, but I just really, I can see how both Sheldrake's work and your work are such a critical piece of this interconnectedness, this web. And so I just wanted to honor that and thank you for providing a container yourself in which we can discuss these kinds of things and hopefully bring it to a larger, to a larger community discussion about what's going on our planet.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thanks so much for being with me today, Gary. I really appreciate it. Would you give us just where people can go find out about the webinar, your websites and social media? I know you're very active on social media, so.
Sure. So there it is. It's archetypalnature.com is the website. And it's 5 sessions and it begins September 13th. And you'll find it all there. And also watch for the Time is Art movie, which is coming as well on 11/11/15, and syncmovie.com is their website.
Awesome. Thank you. And you are active on Facebook. What's your Facebook name?
Well, the Facebook for this would be Matter Psyche, facebook.com/Matter Psyche.
Great.
And there's Jung and Crop Circles, facebook.com/Jung and Crop Circles as well. And there's also gsbobroff.com on Facebook.
It's good to be multifaceted these days, for sure, especially when you have such great content that is good to get out there. So good work. Thank you so much, Gary. I really appreciated talking to you today and really enjoyed all of your stories and looking forward to so much more in the webinar series.
Thank you.
Thank you.